Why are people who have experienced detention not heard? To understand why people who have experienced detention are not heard, I think we have to consider the lengths the UK government goes to prevent such hearing from taking place. To understand why, in other words, I think we have to understand how, and then we have to consider what might change. Whatever else it might be, and whatever else it might be about to become, the hostile environment is a complex apparatus for preventing people from being heard, at the core of which is immigration detention. To detain a person is to separate them from their networks of community and support. At the moment a person is detained, as the Refugee Tales Project has documented, there is a high likelihood that, for a period at least, all normal channels of communication will be broken. There is no guarantee of legal representation. A person will be denied access to their phone and therefore to all their contacts. It will very likely be unclear at the point of detention where, which is to say, in which detention centre, they will be detained. To detain a person, in other words, is to stop them from being heard. It is to break a person's lines of communication with the outside world. The fact that in the UK such detention is fundamentally arbitrary, that it begins without due process and that it has no defined point of release, intensifies such a break. The suddenness of detention, the fact that it happens without warning, is echoed, as the Refugee Tales Project has learned over many years, by a lack of clarity throughout the system. The fact that the person who is detained does not know when or how they will leave detention means that they are caught in a process which it is not possible to trust. The absence of procedures on which a person might depend, the fact that processes of decision-making are arbitrary and opaque, means that the basis for reliable communication is broken down. We should not overlook the fact that, in this arbitrary context, acts of cruelty are not uncommon. Numerous people have reported in the stories they have shared with Refugee Tales that they have been subjected to mock deportation procedures. We might speculate, I think, that a context framed by arbitrariness is highly likely to generate further arbitrary acts. Either way, people who have shared their stories with Refugee Tales frequently point to the fact that it isn't possible to know who in detention it is possible to speak to with any expectation of safety. The sheer arbitrariness of detention is a means of breaking communication down. And then consider details of the processes by which the wider hostile environment is currently maintained, that array of policies and practices to which detention is key. Consider the fact, for instance, that at any moment while in detention, a person might be relocated to another part of the detention estate. Or consider the fact that after they have been released, a person might at any moment be redetained. Or that, while living with the prospect of redetention, a person might find themselves moved from one part of the country to another in a process the Home Office calls dispersal. The process of dispersal has an interesting history, long practiced as it was in colonial regimes. And indeed, if we want to understand how and why people who have experienced detention are not heard, it is instructive to read accounts of colonial practice. Writing about dispersal, by which he meant precisely dislocating people by moving them from one detention centre to another, Frantz Fanon observed the effect of separating people from each other, of fragmenting them with the sole objective of making any cohesion impossible. Consider the fact also that, as the Volunteer's Tale in Volume 3 of Refugee Tales reported, interviews which form part of the asylum process can themselves become mechanisms for stopping a person from being heard. As the person who shared their experience in that tale reported, their interview took the form of something like 100 questions immediately repeated so as to produce a discrepancy, any discrepancy, between one set of 100 answers and another. Or consider the fact that the proceedings of the Asylum and Immigration Tribunal, whether a bail hearing or a deportation hearing, are not written down, that there is no full transcript of the proceedings, and that therefore the voice of the person who has sought asylum is not in any official sense recorded. Or consider the fact that what shapes and informs the whole process is a well-documented culture of disbelief, the effect of which is to undermine the process of communication even before it starts, even before a person has started speaking. To consider these mechanisms, and these are just a few of the mechanisms by which the UK government prevents the person who has experienced detention from being heard, is to glimpse the scale of the operation by which such silencing takes place. It is not an accident that people who have experienced detention are not heard. It is a consequence of a complicated apparatus of policies, rules, and practices, at the centre of which is detention on the basis of a person's nation and race. If we were to generalize, we might say that people's stories are being systematically excluded, or, to use a word from the 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees, that such stories are systematically expelled. The question is, why? Why would a government go to such lengths to prevent people who have experienced detention from being heard? What might change, in other words, if people who have experienced detention were able to speak freely, without fear, and in contexts in which they might be properly listened to and heard? The answer, I want to suggest, is that everything might change. To detain a person arbitrarily is to breach or to deny that person's human rights. It is a breach or denial that is only sustainable by ruthless silencing. The moment a person is allowed to speak, not just about detention, but about their life, about anything or everything that constitutes their experience, about what they have witnessed, about people they have loved and lost, about their desires and their dreams, their hopes and ambitions, at that point, when they start to be heard, their rights as people become clear. People who are detained are prevented from being heard because if they were properly heard, it would not be possible to detain them, because only when people are silenced is it possible to disregard their most basic rights. From which I think there are two lessons that might be learned. The first is that a government intent on the kind of denial of human rights entailed by detention is likely to go to greater and greater lengths to prevent people from being heard. We can see this direction of travel in the newly announced Sovereign Borders Bill, with its proposal that anybody granted asylum in the United Kingdom, as opposed to people who might secure asylum by being resettled from abroad, will remain permanently vulnerable to deportation. The long-term intention is to ensure that the stories of people seeking asylum are to be heard elsewhere. It is a new and deeply troubling way of stopping people being heard. Against this, it is crucial to recognize the power that being heard holds. People who have experienced detention are not heard because the whole apparatus of detention depends on such silencing taking place. Not just in order that the realities of detention are not known, but because it is only through silencing that a government can deny human rights. Which means that being heard is a most powerful act, an act that in itself asserts rights. There are many ways to answer the question, why are people who have experienced detention not heard? But one answer, for sure, is that detention depends on silence. People who have experienced detention must be heard in the fullness of their experience, and people who have not experienced detention must listen and must help create spaces in which others listen.